Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 188 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Warfare, especially medieval warfare, has traditionally been thought to be a wholly masculine pursuit, far outside the realm of women. But in the real world, women are to be found everywhere in warfare, not only as casualties, but as suppliers of food and medical treatment, as well as both emotional and financial support, and sometimes even playing a role in combat. This week, I spoke with Dr. Helen Nicholson about the role of women in the Crusades. Helen is Professor Emeritus at Cardiff University and one of the world's foremost experts on the Crusades, especially the Templars. She's the author, editor, and co-editor of literally dozens of books, including The Knights Templar, Medieval Warfare, Theory and Practice of War in Europe 300 to 1500, and Chronicle of the Third Crusade, a translation of the Itinerarium Peregrinorum et Gesta Regis Ricardi. Her new book is Women in the Crusades. Our conversation on the many different roles of women in crusading, how both real and fictional women were used for propaganda, and where to find women in the sources is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Helen, for joining me to talk about women in the Crusades. This is a really important topic, and I'm so happy to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, you are an expert on Crusades, on Templars, on military history in general. What made you decide to dig into women on the Crusades?
Well, I've been looking at women in the Crusades for a long time, ever since I picked up a copy of the Itinerarium Peregrinorum et Gesta Regis Ricardi, which would have been about 1984. And I was reading about events in the East because I had been reading about events in Britain while Richard I was away on crusade, and I wanted to know what he was actually doing and how what was going on in England was affecting what was going on where he was in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I was working my way through this quite convoluted Latin text, which is one of our primary sources for the Third Crusade. And I came across the Templars there, as I've mentioned to some of my friends before, mentioned in very glowing terms, which is quite odd because when I looked at the secondary sources, they said that the Templars were not respected by the time of the Third Crusade, but they evidently were. And I also came across this mysterious figure, Sybil, Queen of Jerusalem, whom I never found mentioned anywhere by secondary sources at all, and various references to women involved in the campaign, killing Muslim prisoners and helping to fill in the fortifications around Acre while the Crusaders were sieging Acre to try and recover it from Saladin. I thought, well, there are clearly women here, but if you look at the secondary sources about the Crusades, they have hardly anything to say about women. How very odd. Well, sometime later, I started my PhD, which was looking at views of the military orders, which sprang out of this discovery that the Templars were, in fact, very much respected at the time of the Third Crusade. And as I was doing my research, I was picking up references to women as well, women as patrons of the Templars, again, not mentioned at all by the secondary sources, and women in the military orders, which, again, the secondary sources had very little to say about. And I even found a few Templar women, which, again, the secondary sources, there are no women in the Templars. Well, there were, sorry, sunshine. And quite a lot of involvement in women in crusades, in fact. So I started putting examples together. And after I finished my PhD and I was applying for jobs, I said, I want to work on women in the Crusades. And this was approved at that time by the faculty. However, various other people said, no, you can't do that because I'm working on this. Well, sometimes their works have come out and sometimes they haven't. I've just gone on collecting material. And a few years ago, talking to publisher OUP, they said, well, do you have any books in mind? I said, well, I've got all this material on women in the Crusades and I've got a lot. And they said, well, why don't you write it then? So the book is the result. So it's slightly, therefore, too much material really to fit in because I've been collecting it for so long. And when I came to condense it, I obviously lost some of the details I wouldn't like to put in. And reading back over it, there's a few points I think I could have said that more clearly. I think that's not clear anymore, which I apologize to readers, but I hope that they will enjoy the great mass material that there is on women in the Crusades, because as I say, if you look at the older secondary sources, not so much the things written since about 1970, but if you're looking at things written in the 19th century and in the earlier 20th century, there's very little reference to women, or when they do appear, it's, oh, this is extraordinary. We don't expect to find women here. What's she doing here? She has no business being here. Well, she has every business being there.
It's so true. It's so true. I was speaking with Mark Bailey about serfs last week, and we were talking about how there are things in the law code saying this is what you can do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what people were doing. And when you look at the Crusades, you have people saying this is a very manly art. You should be doing this if you're a man. Women are excluded. But that's not what you find when you look at the sources, right? So which sources were you looking at to find these women?
Well, the narrative accounts do mention them, although, like the Itinerarium Peregrinorum, they tend to appear only where they can make a good moral point. Mm-hmm. So, for example, to show how weak the Muslims are, that our women were killing Muslims, therefore they're obviously completely defeated. And the Muslim accounts use them in the same way. Oh, the Christians are putting women into the battlefield. Well, they probably weren't actually, but anyway. And that just shows how depraved and barbaric Christians are. So when you're reading these sources, you have to always bear in mind that the writers, everybody who's mentioned there is there for a purpose, some moralizing or political purpose, whatever the person is actually writing for. And therefore, each example has to be weighed up carefully to think, well, is this a likely context? And sometimes you will discover, in fact, the narrative sources have invented people. Mm-hmm. And recently, the scholar Hilary Rhodes identified one of the supposed women on the First Crusade, Florina of Burgundy, was in fact a complete invention. And Albert of Aachen, or his source, appears to have mixed up an account of crusaders moving through some of the cities in the Byzantine Empire and then dying in battle later, and having made some of these cities' names into the names of Florina and her supposed husband, who's not her husband either, because again, they don't exist, these people. That's probably not Albert, because I'm sure his Latin was a lot better than that. It's some mangled account that he's tried to straighten out and turn into a proper story. So we have a woman who doesn't exist. It makes a good moral point, though. It's very dangerous for queens and princesses and noblewomen to go on crusade. They shouldn't go. Which I suppose is sound advice, because they like to be killed, but at the same time, you could say the same for men. So the narrative counts have to be weighed up very carefully. And you always have to remember, why is this person writing and where have they got this information from? Because again, whoever supplied them with the information, it's likely to come already with its own inbuilt twist. But then there are other accounts. There are letters written by people who are out in the East writing home, or, for example, during the Crusade of Louis IX of France, in his first crusade when he was in Egypt, his wife, Margaret of Provence, who was with him, she was left behind at Damiette while Louis was marching down to try and conquer Cairo. He didn't conquer it. And she was writing to her sister in England, Queen Eleanor. So Margaret sending Eleanor information, and possibly as a result of that, Eleanor and her husband took the cross, although they never went to the East. So there are some letters. There are also some letters that are probably forgeries, but which seem to be roughly contemporary, so they tell you what people thought that Crusaders would be writing about. There are legal records, sometimes because somebody has gone on crusade and therefore they haven't turned up in court. So where is she? Why isn't she in court? She's gone to the East. She's joined the crusade. She's going on pilgrimage, because pilgrimage is another word used to describe a crusade. 3 sisters are supposed to turn up in court, and only 2 of them are there. Where is the other one? She's in Ireland. No, she's not. She's gone to the East, and she never came back, so we assume she died. And so at least that's true as far as people at the time knew it to be. There were also wills. Either the husband and wife are making their wills before they go out to the East, or when they're out of the East, the husband is making his will, or the wife will be making her will, and they're mentioning other people who are there with them on the campaign. So it's very interesting. Again, we assume that's pretty much accurate. Occasionally, you don't know where people are. So when the young Queen of France, this is Louis IX's second crusade, makes Isabel, his daughter-in-law, makes her will. She's leaving money to her maidservants. We don't actually know whether they are with her on the crusade, but they probably are. So quite a lot of this is quite scattered evidence, and scholars have been collecting it in the archives and various records, printed or unprinted around Europe, and I've been collecting it as I go along and drawing it out of other people's work, and everything is referenced. So the book has an inordinate number of footnotes, so people can go look it up for themselves.
Yes, well, this is the sign of a good book, I think, where you can have all these trails that you can follow later. Plus, your book has maps and it has family trees and it has a chronology of the Crusades, which is very, very helpful, yes. I think.
Yes, I did think at the beginning it should be in chronological order, then I realized very quickly that you couldn't do this in chronological order. The only way to get it into sensible organization was thematically, it's got a chronology, and the chronology is towards the back of the book. It was originally at the front, but the publisher said, let's put it at the back. That is People can look at it if they want it, but it won't confuse them. The family trees, again, as I was producing, first of all, they're essential because so many people have the same name, of course, because names run in families. But also, as I put the family trees together, I realized how many crusaders are related to each other. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, who of course married twice, Louis VII of France, and then Henry II of England. So she has children from both marriages, and they're all involved in the Crusades in one way or another. So sometimes it seems that everything is going back to Eleanor. And the traditional histories will tend to point at Louis and at Henry, but actually Eleanor is much more the central figure here. It's quite a few years since the Crusaders historian Jonathan Riley-Smith pointed out the importance of women in transmitting ideas of crusade. And this is very clear when I started putting these family trees together. Another person who is very much a central figure is Blanche or Blanca of Castile, who was the wife of King Louis VIII of France and mother of Louis IX. And it's not just Blanche she never goes on crusade herself. Her husband and her sons go on crusade. She acts as regent of France while Louis IX is away on crusade. Again, this person is her niece, this person is her grandchild, this person is her cousin. She's writing to her sister, or her sister is writing to her. She's writing to her cousin, and they're all involved in crusading, and their families were all involved in crusading.
Yes, these family trees have been really helpful in reading the book. Plus, you're always contextualizing which person this is and how they are related. And I think that's really important. So let's dig into this for a second. How might women have spread ideas about the crusade so that they could encourage their husbands, brothers, nephews to go on crusade? How might they have accomplished this?
If you look at the contemporary accounts, which eulogize queens or noble women, they depict the women actively encouraging their husbands or sons to go. He said he was thinking about going to serve God. And she said, yes, you must do this. And while you are there, I will pray for you and I will look after the kingdom and you must go. And this will be an act great, very pleasing to God. We don't actually know what the conversations were. And obviously the chronicler was imagining it. You could imagine that something like that happened, a conversation about if it's in the Iberian Peninsula, and many of the women who were encouraging crusades were in fact encouraging them in the Iberian Peninsula where there's this frontier with the Moors, or the Muslims from North Africa. Then there's land involved as well as serving Christ. So the royal family of Castile will think that they will get land from attacking the Muslims on their frontier, but also this is a work for God. So you are gathering additional territory, which is spun as reconquest because it was held by the Visigoths, the great Christian empire that was there before the Muslims invaded. So we're going to reconquer this land for Christ. And yes, this is a holy war. Castile is doing God's work. And the queen will ensure that her son or her husband has all the troops that he needs, and she will govern the country in his absence, and he will be at the frontier fighting against the Moors. So it becomes a family affair in that way. And we can imagine that brides encouraged their husbands, having married into a crusading family, the husband found that he was being unfavorably compared to his in-laws. My father and my brothers have all been on crusade. They are real knights. They've served God. Why haven't you been? And it would be a good idea. You should go. Mm-hmm. It clearly doesn't always work like that. After all, Eleanor of Aquitaine went on the Second Crusade with her first husband, Louis VII. But her second husband, Henry II, never went. It's easy to imagine why he didn't go. He had an empire to deal with. He never had the leisure to go on crusade. And interestingly, he wouldn't let any of his sons go either. Neither would he let any of them go out to the east and become ruler of Jerusalem, although they were linked. They were related to the Christian rulers of Jerusalem. But as Henry couldn't do it himself, nobody else was going to do it. So it doesn't always work. But he did give money to the east through the Hospitallers, the Templars, the military orders, and they did use that money in defense of the Holy Land. So there was some link there. Although in the case of Henry of England, of course, his grandfather, Fulk of Anjou, had been out in the east as well. So there's an Angevin tradition of crusading even before he married Eleanor. Jonathan Riley-Smith's research, however, when he was looking into this a couple of decades ago now, shows that some families dramatically changed their attitude towards crusading after marriage alliance had been made. So maybe it's not just the wife who's arguing, maybe it's the in-laws when over the marriage feast are saying, well, we've all been to crusade, why haven't you?
Yes, because as you were saying, you can definitely make yourself rich sometimes if you're successful on crusade, but you also are spiritually rich when you go on crusade. So I can imagine there would be quite a lot of pressure to go from the in-laws, from the wives at home, perhaps. It's also a convenient way to get rid of your husband if you really want to. But if you're left behind, there are some dangers. So let's talk about the home front for a minute, because I think most people imagine that women are on the home front. What are some of the dangers for the women who are left behind?
Well, if she hadn't previously been involved in running the estates, and many women, in fact, would have been, her first problem is to establish authority. So before her husband leaves, he has to accustom his subordinates to working with her and her to working with his subordinates to make sure they're all able to communicate with each other and understand what they're doing. And a number of scholars have looked at how this worked at various lordships within France and Flanders, for example. And you could see the wife being associated with her husband in issuing charters before the husband leaves, and maybe having her own seal produced, and particularly working with leading ecclesiastics, because if she has the backing of the church, it's much more difficult to argue with her. The leading ecclesiastics will always excommunicate the principle makers, for example. In theory, while the husband is away, she will have the protection of the church, but it's all very well having the protection in words, you need it in action as well. So you do need to know that your nobles are not going to revolt and that you have got the actual physical as well as spiritual support of the church. With those things said, the wife, yes, she ought to already have some experience running her own estates. She would normally have her own land as well as wider realms that her husband rules. The wife should be able to govern the estate without too much trouble. There are stories of, there's at least one legal case when someone returns from the Holy Land, discovers his daughter's married the Reeve, who was obviously the main administrator. This is obviously a much smaller estate. It's not a kingdom, it's a small estate. And did she want to marry him, or did he force her to marry him because he wanted to take over the control of the estate? He was not very happy about it, so it goes to law. Unfortunately, I don't think we know the outcome of that one, yes, whether it's a forced marriage or not. Yes, husband will be worrying whether his, or indeed in this case, father will be worrying whether the person who's left in charge is going to be able to hold their own against their various enemies, while she'll be worrying about whether her menfolk are coming back again and whether she's going to have to pay a ransom to recover them. Count Henry I of Champagne, on his way back from the east in 1170, I think, was captured by bandits and was ransomed by the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Comnenus, but not everybody was so fortunate. So you might have to wait for the family to pay. There were organizations among the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims who would raise money to ransom prisoners, but this all takes time and negotiation, and Tutors are quite reluctant to let go of valuable prisoners because they're always hoping to get more for them. Mm-hmm. So it might take quite a lot of negotiation. There is a local story in Herefordshire, so not so far away from where I live, of a wife who cut off her hand and sent it to Saladin to ransom her husband. But this is just a story. The historian Elizabeth Sibrey looked into this because it's her local church where this is told. And she deduced that in fact the story was produced in the early 19th century to explain why one of the effigies in the local church was missing a hand. The story is still in circulation. Because I gave a talk on women in the Crusades quite a few years ago now in Hereford, and somebody stood up at the end and said, "Do you know this story?" And it's true. And I thought, well, as far as Elizabeth can tell, it isn't.
Oh, well.
But it's interesting that these stories are still circulating, that people are aware of the possibility that you might have to negotiate to get captives back. And yet another problem, supposing your menfolk don't come back and you don't know whether they're alive or dead. If your husband's gone, can you marry again? There's a set amount of time you should wait. If he does come back and you've remarried, then technically you're guilty of adultery, and that is tricky. Mm-hmm. Alternatively, supposing he doesn't come back for a very long time, and then this stranger reappears and claims to be your long-lost brother, your long-lost uncle, your long-lost father, which is what happened to Countess Joanne of Flanders in the 1220s. And she denied that this was her father. And the people of Flanders said, yes, it is. We actually assume that a lot of people were just jumping on this bandwagon, because if they deposed the countess and brought in this stranger, they would have a lot of leverage with him, because they would have been the people that put him into power. Mm-hmm. And the King of England jumps on the bandwagon as well. Henry III was, in fact, not yet of age at this point. But anyway, so yes, let's support this person he's not got anything to do with the King of France, because Joanna was supported by the King of France. This might give us more power in Flanders. However, yes, the pretender to the County of Flanders was arrested by the King of France, Louis VIII, and cross-examined by the Bishop of Senlis, the hospitaller, Mother Guerin, who remembered the original Count of Flanders and his wife, and said, "So where did you marry your wife?" And the man couldn't remember, thereby proving that he was fraudulent.
You would think that
So
would
he
be
ran
one of the
away.
things. That would be one of the things on your cue card, right?
You really would think so, wouldn't you? If he'd been put up to it, that's something that you should know. It even means that he wasn't even in Flanders when it happened, because it was important. It would have been a great occasion.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Joanna had him arrested and hanged. But people still said that this had been her father, that she was a parricide.
Mm-hmm.
So she was never able to rid herself of that suspicion. Was she validly countess or not? So another problem faced anyone in authority who was left behind.
And for the women who were not in authority, so just regular women, you were saying that the church gives you protection. But if your husband is killed, that protection goes away right away, doesn't it?
It does. And if he owed any debts, suddenly there's the bailiffs at the door demanding that you pay. And then what do you do? Mm-hmm. So yes, they're carrying off your stock and your possessions because you have no money, unless he'd had the foresight to make provision for this before he left. And you would think that people would, but perhaps they were too much of a hurry, too excited, or they didn't have the means to make provision for their family. This could leave the wife in a very difficult position, as she has debts she can't clear. She might have to just borrow off a religious order or of anybody else who would lend her money in order to clear the debts and be left in penury. Yes, it's easy for us to be critical because we don't know people's individual situations. At least one scholar has accused some of these people of just basically selling the family silver in order to go on crusade without any thought of what would happen if they weren't able to come back again.
Well, this is one reason that you cite in the book as a reason why women would go with their husbands or brothers or fathers on crusade. And there is an expectation you've mentioned, I think around 1300, there's already an expectation that women are going to be there. They should be given rations. They should be given pay for the work that they do. So where do we see women showing up actually within the crusade itself?
Well, sometimes mentioned in those donation charters I mentioned at the beginning, when you're out in the East and or on your way to the East, so the port is before you embark, and you make a donation to a religious house asking them to pray for you, and husband and wife are doing this together. Or even when you're out there on the crusade, during the Fifth Crusade, one people were making a donation to the fairly new military order of Our Lady of the Teutons, the Teutonic order. And perhaps they decided that things were getting a bit sticky. They needed some extra prayer support. Mm-hmm. And if things went wrong and they died, then the order would pray for their souls and they'd have a better chance of getting into heaven. Or indeed, they might have a better chance of survival because they had this pure, hardworking religious order supporting them. We don't have any other information about this couple during the crusade, but we know they were there because they made this donation. The Teutonic order kept all the paperwork, and so they could make sure that they got everything that was due to them. Mm-hmm. Religious orders were very good at keeping all the paperwork. So often we have good ideas about people who were making donations to religious orders, but we don't know about what else they were doing because nobody else was keeping their records. Or they did keep them, they've been lost over the centuries. We still have the Teutonic Order's archives. So what else are people doing? When they are mentioned in the narrative sources, the women might be carrying water for the soldiers fighting on the battlefield, or bandages, or just standing on the sideline shouting. And I imagine something like a football crowd, or indeed a baseball crowd, if that's your sport. Then during sieges, women were expected to help out with the labouring work, so carrying ammunition to people hurling missiles, send the women and the children out, find suitable missiles, stones of the right sort of shape to hurl, or indeed stones and earth to fill in ditches if you're part of the besieging army, so that people can roll their artillery or their siege wagons or their ladders and towers and whatever else you happen to have on wheels right up to the walls of the city. And of course, you can't do that unless it's level, so you have anybody who isn't fighting is expected to carry earth with them, or stones, or anything else. Or in one story from the Third Crusade, the woman's own body, when she's hit by a missile, is lying dying in the ditch. And everyone gathers around her, and her husband's bending over her weeping, and she says, "Let my body stay here. So my body will continue to work for the cause even when I'm dead." Is the story true or not? We don't know, but it's such a good story. And that's why it got recorded, of course. An inspirational story about even the non-combatants make a physical contribution to the crusade. Women also could be on the battlements hurling things when you're defending against a siege, or indeed, if it's the woman's castle, if you're in the Holy Land and you're the lady of the castle, which there were quite a few noble families where the only heir was a woman. So someone like Shiva of Tiberias defending her castle against Saladin in July 1187, you're in command and commanding the forces and sending it to help. Unfortunately, in that particular case, the army that was coming to relieve the castle met Saladin on the horns of Hattin and was defeated. And then Shiva has to negotiate peace terms with Saladin and evacuate the castle of Tiberias. Another example of that is the Lady of Transjordan, Stephanie, who had to surrender her castles to Saladin in order to ransom her son, Free IV of Turon. And in that case, this is an example given by the Muslim writers as how chivalric Saladin was. The defenders of the castles refused to release the castles, even though it would mean that Humphrey would be released. And so Stephanie goes back to Saladin and says, I don't know what to do. And he says, well, don't worry, you go off to Tyre, you're still safe with me, and eventually I'll capture the castle, which eventually he did, and then Humphrey is released. As the victorious leader, Saladin was perfectly within his rights to imprison Stephanie as well, but he didn't do that. So this was, yes, made him more respected by both his own side and also by the Crusaders, who thought we can trust this man to keep to his word. Mm-hmm. How you treat women was always regarded by all sides as a measure of civilization. If they don't know how to treat women, they're barbarians. If they're treating women right, we know these are humane, civilized people, pious, God-fearing, and we can work with them and we respect them. It may seem odd to think that there's so much mutual respect on both sides. Everyone's aware that the other side also are pious and worshipping God, but they think they're doing it wrong. Mm-hmm. That's the only reason we're fighting. Mm-hmm. Some of these stories about women defending the castles are quite humorous. Margaret of Beverley, who was in Jerusalem when Saladin was besieging it, at least according to her younger brother, so we have to believe him, said she put a cooking pot on her head. This is a bit of a stereotype, non-combatants wearing kitchen implements as armour. Nevertheless, she was still hit by a stone that had been fired at the walls and was badly hurt. And the other side of this is the women as the heroic defenders themselves. When the men are not able to fight, for example, there are not enough men. So the Hussites defending the new town in Prague during the Hussites' Crusades against the Catholics, the women are on the walls shouting defiance and hurling missiles or fighting with any weapon they can have to hand, and eventually getting struck down by the enemy because they are not properly armed and armored. This shows their martyrs and how they're inspired by their faith and by their determination to win. The other side think that Hussites are barbarians because they're sending women into battle. This is not something that civilized people do.
It's amazing how much women are used as propaganda tools in these stories, because it seems to be, you can't have one, as you were saying at the beginning of this podcast, you can't have one that's neutral. They're always being used to tell the story or to demonstrate something about your own people or the people on the other side of the battlefield.
Yes, and you can notice this even now in modern news stories. Mm-hmm. Although I won't particularize, I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast could think of examples.
Yes.
My husband gets quite bitter about it. They're saying this because it's a woman. If it was a man, nobody would be so sympathetic. It's notable. And in fact, some crusade preachers were even told, emphasize the way the women are victims and how the enemy is attacking the women. And that will stir people up to come and fight. Whereas if you say the men are being killed, people think, well, yes, that's what they're for, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Men are supposed to fight and they're supposed to be in the battle line. But if the women are being killed and the young girls are being killed, then that is appalling. These are atrocities and you must go out and avenge them. Mm-hmm. This does mean that accounts of, for example, when Acre falls in 1291 to the Mamluks, emphasize the desperate things that are happening to the women, which is extremely depressing. Yes, my students did complain about having too many bloodthirsty battles during our classes because my classes were at lunchtime.
Yeah.
Yes, so descriptions of women and children being cut down. Mm-hmm. And obviously the stories of the men being cut down are very tragic too, but you can tell that the writers are concentrating on the appalling atrocities that are being committed by the Mamluks. This is why we must still fight, because this is what they did to our women.
Yeah. I think part of it is being characterized as non-combatants, right? This is what makes it uncivilized. But I think it's important that you mention a couple of instances. I think the Crusades that are happening in Eastern Europe, especially, where you have women who are having active roles, including burning people in a church. So I think it's important to recognize as well that these are women who are so committed that they are also acting in ways that are violent. They shouldn't always be characterized as being passive, right?
Indeed, it's easy to fall in with the propagandist and forget that the women also can be just as violent as the men. Mm-hmm. In fact, in the story about the women cutting down the Muslim prisoners during the Third Crusade, they're more violent because they don't have the strength the men would have, so it takes them longer to kill the prisoners than it would do if they were just able to use one single blow of the sword. Mm-hmm. And the story about the Hussite women burning the Catholic women alive is particularly distressing. It indicates, I think, to the person that recorded it, how savage this war had become because both sides were so invested in it and neither side was prepared to even see the other side as proper human beings. Mm-hmm. It come to the point where both sides were seeing the other side as some sort of monstrosity.
Yes.
And the whole of the Hussite Crusades are marked by appalling acts of violence.
And children were the victims of that particular incident as well. We have mentioned children a couple of times. I think it's important to mention children because you can't have women without birth control, without children. So we know that women were invited on the crusade in some ways for men's health. Could you tell us why it was important for women to come along on the crusade?
Yes. Now, the churchmen writing about the crusade refused to acknowledge this, but it was widely said that sex was essential for health, and maintaining semen inside yourself as a man was very unhealthy to semen out. Now, women have a monthly bleeding, and that gets rid of any surplus fluids. So it's not so important for women, although women do need sex as well. It's particularly important for men. And this account of the Third Crusade I mentioned at the beginning, the Itinerarium Paganorum, says at the end that thousands of men died because they completely avoided women during the crusade as a sign of their piety. And that's why they died. And I thought this can't be true, is what he means. And then I found the French version of the speech, which some scholars say is the original, and others say they're both using the same source. And he says exactly the same thing. So this is the line. If you avoid sex, you are likely to die. Therefore, husbands should take their wives with them. And the crusade planner, who was planning a crusade in the later 14th century, said particularly, this is Philippe de Mézières, they have women along for the ordinary soldiers as well. They should be respectably dressed because they're on Christ's work. There should be plenty of women. And the way he says it, you'd think initially, well, maybe they're just maidservants. And it goes on, you think, no, these are actually prostitutes. Mm-hmm. They're very respectable, holy prostitutes.
Yes.
And they have to be there.
And
otherwise, the men will resort to Muslim women. Mm-hmm. And you can't be having that.
No,
children will result. Children will result, yes. And you don't want your Christian men mixing with other strange women. Yes, as you said, no birth control. So you are going to end up with babies. Mm-hmm. And if the woman doesn't die because of the difficult conditions on the crusade, then there'll be certain times when the women can't do anything because they're either doubled up with pregnancy pains, morning sickness, or just being too large to move around, or indeed in childbirth. And ideally, the woman is supposed to stay abed for some weeks after she's given birth, or anyway, not go out. But this isn't practical. Mm-hmm. And Margaret of Provence, Queen of France, Louis IX's wife, who was left at Damietta when Louis was marching south, gave birth and has to leave Damietta before her time is up because Louis being captured and ransomed, and part of the ransom is giving up Damietta. Unfortunately, Louis was captured about the time that Margaret was due to give birth, so this was very difficult. They sent out a search party for him, and they couldn't find him, and she has to call together the crusaders and the merchants in the town and say, please don't run away, we're going to stay here and defend the city. And they're saying there's no food, so she has to buy food. All this, and she's also just given birth and is trying to look after her young baby. So yes, multitasking with a vengeance.
It's incredible, the things that women have gone through over history, especially these women who are in combat zones, because we know that women are still in combat zones. I should mention that there was no proven effective birth control, although people did try birth control. I've done a podcast on that before, so I should clarify that there is no effective, 100% effective birth control.
Yes. Yes, sorry, when we say birth control now, we tend to think of things that are effective, whereas there were various methods that were supposed to work, but they didn't always.
Yes, exactly.
And let's not go to the jokes about that.
No.
There are too many.
There is one place I do want to go, though. We were mentioning that often there was the idea that you didn't want to mix religions, right? One person from one and one person from another in a couple. But there was one really interesting proposal that I think we should get to that was pitched to Edward I, I think, by Pierre Dubois, who was suggesting that women go to the Holy Land, they train up as medics, and then they can be useful also in the marriage market. So can you tell us about this plan that he had?
It's a wonderful plan. He's got really advanced ideas about education because he was going to use the surplus properties of religious orders. And this is centuries before Cardinal Wolsey came up with the same idea in England, and use them to set up schools. So you don't have to be a noble to go to these schools. You can educate anyone that's had suitable, boys and girls. And then, yes, they're going to train boys as preachers and priests, and the women are going to be trained as medics. Then they will go out to the East and either marry Christian noblemen, Byzantine Greeks, or indeed they're going to convert Muslim women to Christianity by talking to them, which means either they're going to learn Muslim languages, whichever, Arabic, Syrian, whatever is appropriate, or they might even end up marrying Muslims themselves. But the idea is that they're going to convert Muslim women to Christianity. And the Muslim women were very anxious to convert when they realized they'd only have one husband, one wife, so they won't be competing with other wives anymore. And then when they've been working out in the East and they've done their great work for Christ, urging their husbands to fight for Christ and expand Christian domains, when they've actually got somebody of their own, they pay that back to the school to pay for their education. Sort of alumni idea, but they're to support the place that educated them. And so these places will be self-financing.
Do we have a sense of how that was received?
Well, not really, because, not with great enthusiasm. I think because it doesn't survive in many manuscripts, and it certainly wasn't put into practice. But it does show that one person was thinking about it, and just one person thinking about it is fascinating. He thought this one through. He obviously thought that the system we had hasn't worked. They'd lost Acre to the Mamluks. There was no sign of them being able to recover lands out of the Eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus was still ruled by Latin Christians, but apart from that, any other attempt to get a crusade off the ground wasn't working. And Edward I himself was tied up with the wars in Scotland, and there was no way he was going to the Eastern Mediterranean soon. So how can we do this by a different way? How about using the diplomacy marriage route? That would work so much better. And what do people need? Well, they need medics. They need education.
It's such an interesting plan because it assumes a lot of things, that women are capable of getting medical training, that they are capable of making the rational arguments that you need to if you want to convert someone who is dedicated to another faith, right? That they are able to have these conversations and to accomplish these goals, and that they are worthy of education. This is a very interesting source.
It's wonderful, isn't it? And also recognizes that there is no good sending male preachers to preach to the women because they won't be allowed to have access to the women, and the women won't listen to them. But why should they listen to these strange men? But if you send women, then the women can speak to the women about things that they're interested in, and they're not a threat. And in fact, the husbands, the menfolk, will be quite happy to have other women there talking because it's just women's talk and it's nothing to do with the men. So Pierre Dubois is actually recognizing the way that feminine culture works as against the masculine culture that he normally operated within, which again is surprisingly sensitive for a writer of this period whose work survives. As in, presumably, most of the people whose work survives, in fact, was fairly way out because otherwise nobody would keep it. We don't have the sort of day-to-day letters and so on. No one bothers to keep those. It's very, very interesting to read. We don't know exactly what anyone had to say about it because they didn't write it down. We just have, I think, the one manuscript.
We are lucky to have it.
Great. Yes.
So as somebody who's been working on warfare, working on crusades, working on military orders, where would you tell scholars that are coming up to look for women in stories of warfare? Where should they look to find them? Because we know it's 50% of the population that they are involved, that there is no warfare without women. So where should people be looking? If they're coming up through the ranks of medieval studies, where should they look for women?
The first thing I'd say is look for women. Because part of the problem has been with this topic, people have not been looking out for them, and you don't see them if they're not looking. And then when you do happen to notice somebody, you say, oh, she's just an exception. Well, I reference in the book the non-exceptionalism movement among female medieval scholars now. They're not exceptional. When people stop calling women exceptional, as you say, 50% of the population, and they are actually involved in everything. But reasons why women get overlooked are sometimes they are there in the sources. For example, someone is making a donation to all the female and male saints, all the male and female saints. So it just comes out as sanctis in Latin, but if it's French, you can see it's male saints and female saints. When anyone translates that into English, they just write the saints. So the women have immediately gone. Mm-hmm. And then my students come along and say, oh, there are no women here. Yes, they are if you look at the original language. And this happens again and again. Again, this is something I noticed in the Itinerary in Peregrinorum. When I found an English translation, which was done back in the 1840s, they'd always translated the word gens, G-E-N-S, as men. And it's a female noun. So in one stroke, the translator had eliminated all the women. So whereas Richard the Lionheart in the Latin was traveling around the Holy Land with his people, which was a mixed army, by the time it got to the 19th century translator, he was traveling around with his men. Mm-hmm. And this happens a lot. It's one of the reasons we tell people not to use translations. But of course, people usually have to start with a translation.
Right.
So you need to be aware that there are women hidden in these words that you wouldn't realize that they were there if you just look at the older translations. And then I say, once you start looking out for them, I think the eye just jumps over things like the references to the women being involved in killing Muslim prisoners. Oh, that's just a silly story. No, stop and note it. Mm-hmm. Because you'll come across another one of those soon. And by the time this is why I've been collecting these stories for so long. By the time you put them together, you realize actually you've got a lot of material. It's quite scattered. I've been working on military orders. It's the same sort of thing. The material is very scattered. Once you start drawing it together, you find that there's a lot. You don't get names mentioned very often, but then it's the same for men. Mm-hmm. You usually only expect the noblemen to be mentioned by name. And likewise, you don't expect the noble women to be mentioned by name. But we have an additional problem with the noble women. Until very recently, a respectable woman's name was not mentioned in public. I think it was the case up to about 1850. Then I was reading a novel from the First World War last night, and they were saying, oh, we shouldn't mention her name. That would be disrespectful. I thought, okay. That is why most of my women have no name.
Yes. It's a very easy way of just making them disappear.
At the time, people would have known who it was. Mm-hmm. But you don't put it down in writing. And it did actually mean that if you had a writer at one step removed who didn't know who it was, they make a guess at the name and get it wrong. So somebody whose name was actually Eleanor comes out as Joanna or something like that. And modern scholars still, or some modern scholars still get confused by this. Oh, it's Joanna. No, that source didn't know what he was talking about. Her name was actually Isabel or something.
This is what expertise means, everybody, is being able to pull these apart because you have spent that much time working with these sources.
Yes, if at all possible, you want the nation charter by the person in question, because that will give her actual name and her actual title. Because she knows who she is, even if nobody else does.
That is actually a very profound statement when we're talking about medieval history and the history of women. Well, thank you so much, Helen. It's just been a pleasure to talk to you about this. Thank you for coming on and telling us about women in the Crusades.
Thank you very much for having me.
To find out more about Helen's work, you can follow her on Twitter at Gawaine's Mum. Her new book is Women in the Crusades, which is out today in the United Kingdom and in May in North America. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on this week, Peter?
Hey. Well, we have Thomas Lambert, and he's been writing about economics in the Middle Ages for us. And he's back to talk about horses and oxen and their use in agriculture in medieval England. Now, I'm a person who really enjoys it when someone's writing about competitive cost analysis.
Yes, you are.
So if you were like that, yeah, this is a piece for you. So it was something I really enjoyed looking at, why is it they would make use of horses or oxen at particular times? What's the differences in these animals in an economical way? So I found it really fascinating stuff.
Mm-hmm. It's really important, I think, when you think about animals, not only what they do, but what they're worth, because that influences people's everyday decisions.
Yeah, so we've got that. Plus, we got pieces on the First Crusade, El Cid, and some pretty cool images of a 14th century strap end with these fantastic beasts inscribed into them. They almost look like manuscript images. Very cool stuff.
It's awesome.
But we've got some important news from you.
Yes, well, the International Medieval Congress at Leeds is starting to put out the call for people to register. So that conference is at the beginning of July, as it is every year. And I actually will be there on the Monday night doing a live medieval podcast with Eleanor Yanniga. So that's going to be super fun. So if everyone is picking their places that they're going in Leeds, make sure you show up on Monday so that you can come to that live recording.
The Medieval Podcast Live.
Yeah, it's going to be good. And I think there's going to be another live podcast there as well, isn't there?
Yeah, the plans also have Bowen Blake, Michael Livingston, and Kelly DeVries. They'll be talking on another night. And yeah, we're hoping to have a lot of fun at Leeds this year.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome. Well, thanks for the update, Peter, and for reminding me to give a shout out for everyone that's going to Leeds. Show up on that Monday night.
Go medieval.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you, as always, to all of the patrons on Medievalist.net's Patreon page, whose generosity helps to support my podcast, as well as the work of other indie writers and podcasters who contribute to their website. Patrons can access all sorts of great stuff, like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as ad-free versions of this podcast. To become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from Crusades to Palisades, follow Medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cebulski, on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life, in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a fantastic day.